By the summer of 1864, you'd think the American Civil War was pretty much over. The Confederacy was getting strangled by a blockade, its cities were falling one by one, and it was just about out of men. But it wasn't done fighting, not yet. Instead, it launched three final, audacious, and frankly desperate offensives to try and claw its way back from the brink. This is the story of that last desperate gamble.
So our story really kicks off right here, at the Siege of Petersburg, Virginia. General Ulysses S. Grant has finally, after so much bloodshed, cornered Robert E. Lee's main army. This means the Confederacy's best fighting force is now pinned down, stuck in a brutal, grinding war of trenches and attrition. They're bleeding out, and they know it.
And that's the big question, right? If Lee's legendary army was trapped and neutralized, why didn't the war just fizzle out then and there? Well, the answer is that while Lee was pinned, other Confederate armies were still out there, still had room to move, and they were about to risk absolutely everything in one final, frantic grasp at victory.
Okay, so to really get what's going on with these gambles, you first have to get inside the heads of the two main commanders locked in this stalemate. Both Grant and Lee saw the siege as a complete nightmare, but for totally different reasons.
This slide really lays out the brutal math for both sides. On one hand, you have Grant. Now, he's often called a butcher for his tactics, but he actually hated watching his men just waste away from disease and the filth of the trenches. For him, a decisive, bloody fight was actually better than that slow, agonizing death. Then there's Lee. He absolutely knew he couldn't win a war of attrition. He was losing men he simply could not replace. He had to break the siege, but a head-on assault, that was just suicide.
So with Lee's hands tied, the Confederacy rolled the dice. They unleashed three huge offensives in other parts of the country. The whole idea was to cause so much chaos in the north that Grant would be forced to loosen his death grip on Petersburg. Each one of these was a massive long shot, and as we're about to see, each one would fail, spectacularly.
All right, let's start with the first gamble. This was an incredibly bold, almost successful raid led by General Jubal Early, and was aimed right at the heart of the Union, Washington, D.C. itself.
The plan was pretty simple, at least on paper. Lee peeled off about 16,000 men under Early and shot them north through the Shenandoah Valley. Now, the goal wasn't really to capture Washington. They knew that was unlikely. The real objective was to get so close, to threaten it so badly, that the politicians in D.C. would completely panic and force Grant to pull troops away from Petersburg to save the capital.
And man, they came terrifyingly close to pulling it off. As you can see, Early gets into Maryland on July 5th. Just 4 days later, at a little battle called Monocacy, a small, scraped-together Union force made an unbelievably heroic stand. They had no chance of winning, but they fought like hell and bought a single precious day. And that one day, it was everything. It was just enough time for Grant to rush veteran troops to Washington's defenses before Early's exhausted men finally showed up.
And get this, to really paint a picture of how hairy this got. When Early's men finally reached Fort Stevens, right on the edge of D.C., President Abraham Lincoln himself was there, standing on the ramparts to watch the skirmish. He was so close to the action that Confederate sharpshooters actually started taking pot shots at him. The attack ultimately failed and Early had to retreat, but wow, what a scare for the Union.
Okay, for our second gamble, we're heading way out west, across the Mississippi River. This is a nearly forgotten part of the war, and the invasion that happened here was part military campaign and part, well, political fantasy.
See, by 1864, the part of the Confederacy west of the Mississippi was basically its own little country. Since the Union controlled the river, getting messages to the capital in Richmond was almost impossible. That meant the commander out there, a guy named Edmund Kirby Smith, was pretty much a king in his own little Kirby Smithdom, and he was under a ton of pressure from Missouri's exiled Confederate politicians to go liberate their home state.
Now, Smith didn't really think they could retake Missouri for good, but he saw a different kind of opportunity. He sent General Sterling Price out with 12,000 men on a huge raid. The goals were kind of all over the place. Grab supplies, cause trouble during the 1864 presidential election to hurt Lincoln's chances, and the big one, hopefully spark a massive pro-Confederate uprising among the locals. But the whole operation was a disaster right from the start. Price moved incredibly slowly, he wasted men and precious time on a bloody, completely pointless attack on a fort called Fort Davidson. By the time he got to the state capital, it was too well defended. So he just kind of meandered west, his army dragging a 500-wagon train full of stolen loot. That big uprising never happened. And eventually, Union forces cornered his army and smashed it at the Battle of Westport. And the final scorecard, it's just brutal. Price started his grand adventure with 12,000 men. He came back with fewer than 6,000. He didn't achieve a single one of his goals. In fact, the raid proved once and for all that Missouri was a solid Union state, and it went on to vote overwhelmingly for Lincoln. It was a total, unmitigated disaster.
And that brings us to the third and final gamble. And folks, this is the most catastrophic of them all. This is General John Bell Hood's doomed invasion of Tennessee, a plan that was born from pure, unadulterated desperation.
This quote really just says it all. The level of wishful thinking here is, well, it's off the charts. The grand idea was that Hood's already battered Army of Tennessee could somehow march north, beat the Union forces waiting for them, liberate 2 whole states, and then march all the way to Virginia to help Lee. It was a military Hail Mary, and in the aggressive, reckless John Bell Hood, they had just the man to attempt it.
The whole campaign was plagued by incompetence. You're not going to believe this, but at Spring Hill, Tennessee, Hood had a golden, once-in-a-lifetime chance to trap an entire Union army. But because of a complete breakdown in command and a series of confusing orders, his army basically just went to sleep, and the entire Union force just marched right past them in the dead of night. Hood was beyond furious, and his rage was about to have some deadly, deadly consequences.
Still seething, the very next day, Hood ordered a massive, head-on frontal assault against the dug-in Union position at Franklin. His own generals begged him not to do it, calling it madness, but Hood wouldn't listen. The result was a slaughter, a complete slaughter. Just look at those casualty numbers. It wasn't a battle, it was murder.
But this right here, this number, tells the real heartbreaking story. 6. 6 Confederate generals were killed or mortally wounded in just a few hours. Think about that. The Army's entire leadership, its brain trust, was effectively wiped out in a single pointless charge. The Army of Tennessee was broken. And yet, unbelievably, Hood pushed what was left of it onto Nashville, where it was finally and completely shattered.
So you add it all up. Early's raid on Washington, Price's wild adventure in Missouri, and Hood's doomed invasion of Tennessee. It's a trifecta of failure, and it sealed the Confederacy's fate for good.
The fallout from these defeats was total. The Confederacy had thrown its last reserves of men and supplies into the fire, and they were gone. These victories helped secure Lincoln's re-election, which killed any last Southern hope of winning politically by getting a new president who might negotiate peace. And one of its main armies, the Army of Tennessee, for all practical purposes, just ceased to exist. There was nothing left in the tank.
By the winter of 1864, the Confederacy's last desperate gambles had all failed. The Southern Rebellion was broken, not just militarily, but spiritually. So it was no longer a question of if the Union would win. The only question left was when. When would Grant finally break Lee's lines at Petersburg and bring this horribly bloody war to its inevitable end?